Alright, y'all, so we are back here looking at chapter 16. This will be part 2 of our video lecture on chapter 16. So let me pull this, make myself smaller, and let's get back into it. So last time we left off with the election of 52. Ultimately, despite the horrible campaign slogan that I mentioned, the Democrats and Franklin Pierce are going to win, but ultimately Pierce is going to be unpopular. He just tries to make too many people happy, and when you try to make everybody happy, you don't make anybody happy. So we move on, and we talk about the railroad to hell. Yeah, that's a catchy little title I came up with. I'm very proud of myself. No, in all seriousness, y'all, very much the railroad is going to be a big issue that's going to lead to a lot of problems. So let's take a look at it. When we talk about the Transcontinental Railroad, with all of the land in the West, people wanted a Transcontinental Railroad that would ease travel between the East and the West. Okay? The North and South fight about the best route for it. Ultimately, we decide to go with the South because of better terrain and more people. Yo, there were more people in the North, east of the Mississippi River, but when we get west of the Mississippi River, there are more people south. There are more people in the South. Okay, so better terrain. It's a little more flat, not as much when it comes to the mountains and the hills and all that stuff. So the South was a little flatter, a little better terrain, and ultimately more people. But there's a problem. We don't own all of the land. That's where the Gadsden Purchase comes in. So now the U.S. sends James Gadsden to buy the land for $10 million. So the United States is going to send James Gadsden to buy the land for $10 million. Y'all, I have a little. I'm going to pull up the next slide just for a moment. You see this little piece of territory right here? That, the stuff in purple, that is our Gadsden Purchase. So y'all think about it. When we talked about the Mexican War, the United States did pay Mexico $15 million, and we had the war, but we ended up with confirming us taking Texas, taking New Mexico, taking California, and some other territory up here for what? $15 million. Now we paid them 10. We ultimately paid Mexico $10 million for this. Why? Because we need this leg of the Transcontinental Railroad. Okay? Now, when we look at it, what's important to remember, y'all, is that Transcontinental Railroad does not necessarily have to be one railroad line that stretches from east to west. Okay? It could be a series of railroads, but nonetheless, we needed it to go across the country. Now, that's going to bring us to the Nebraska-Kansas crisis. Okay? So, by the way, Gadsden Purchase solidifies the continental U.S. Y'all, after the Gadsden Purchase is done, the United States now controls all of its modern-day continental territory. So, 1853. In 1853, the continental United States, what would become the Continental 48, the 48 mainland states, are now set. Okay? So, look at it. Nebraska-Kansas crisis. Stephen Douglas wanted the route. He wanted that railroad. He wanted the route to be in the north through the area of Nebraska. He wanted to do something with all of that Louisiana Purchase territory. Remember, Louisiana Purchase territory started off small at Louisiana and then branched out and got really big and really wide, right? Well, Stephen Douglas wants to do something with all of that Louisiana Purchase territory, okay? But to get all of this done, it needed to be a territory. Nebraska needed to be an official territory, not just land the United States owns, but an official territory. Remember, there's a process to become a territory and then to become a state. So it needed to be a territory, but to get this done, Douglas needed the help of Southerners. So he proposed making two territories, Kansas and Nebraska, both with popular sovereignty. Okay, so he proposes Kansas and Nebraska. Remember, they're both north of the Missouri Compromise line of 3630. So what are we going to do? Whatever. Well, Douglas proposes make them make two states, both with popular sovereignty. Douglas hoped they would both be free, but most people thought Kansas would be slave and Nebraska would be free. Why? Because Nebraska was above Kansas. So we add two states. The top one's going to be a free state. The southern one would be a slave state. Okay. So Douglas hoped they would both be free, but most people thought Kansas as slave and Nebraska as free. By doing this, though, it would void or null the Missouri Compromise. That caused riots in Boston. Huh? Yo, it's real simple. Basically, people up in the Northeast, around New England, in particular in Boston, are saying, no, you can't do this. You can't allow Kansas to have slavery because it's above the 3630 line. What people are going to start to say, what people in Boston are going to start to do is, it's going to cause riots regarding the Fugitive Slave Act. They're going to say, if you can put slavery above the 3630 Act, I don't have to follow the Fugitive Slave Act. If you can put slavery above the 3630 line, if you can put slavery into Kansas, that's, in essence, avoiding the Missouri Compromise that said no slavery above the 3630 line. So if you're going to avoid and ignore and just totally dismiss the Missouri Compromise, we're going to dismiss the Fugitive Slave Act that came as a result of the Compromise of 1850. So we start to see these problems. Now, because of all of the turmoil and divisions between people, new political parties are going to sprout up and combine. The most important of which is going to be the Republicans. Okay, what we see is that this arose as Democrats lost power in the South and Whigs got mixed with other ideas. So we're seeing a lot of party shifting happening. Nonetheless, Democrats are still going to be dominant, and Democrats are still going to be a holistic and dominant party in America. But the Republicans are now emerging. So what we're seeing is, what we consider the modern day Republican Party is now being formed. The modern day Democratic Party was formed in the 1820s and 30s with Andrew Jackson. So it's been rolling on. Now we got the Republican Party, which is being formed here in the 1850s, largely as a result of all of these issues with slavery and the railroad. All right, sorry about that. Y'all had to pause for a second. All right, so gives us the birth of the Republican Party. We have, and again, map of the Gadsden Purchase. Now, I'll show you this map. Keep in mind. So this is what we're talking about. If you're looking on the computer screen, y'all, we have the Washington Territory, Oregon Territory. Again, California is now a state, but we have Utah Territory, we have New Mexico Territory, right? We have the Missouri Compromise line here, again, the bottom border of Missouri. But we have Kansas and Nebraska, and what's ultimately going to happen with that. So keep that in mind. And then you see this little square, that's this area. I'll probably come back to talking about this, but we have a couple big places, Lawrence, Lecompton, and then Pottawatomie. Okay? We'll come back to that in a moment. But let's look at Bleeding Kansas. Okay? So, like I said, most thought Kansas would be a slave state, but it was decided by popular sovereignty. So people from everywhere, mainly Missouri, but people from all over, come in and try to make the decision and settle the land. Remember, y'all, Missouri is a slave state. If we go back to this map, Missouri is a slave state. And what we're going to see is that a lot of people from Missouri are going to come into Kansas. Maybe some people from Arkansas, maybe some people from Texas, all of which are slave states, right, are going to come into Kansas, the debated territory. Okay? So, they all try to come in and make a decision and ultimately settle the land. So now we have the election that's going to decide everything. But there was a lot of illegal voting for slavery. Again, some of these people from Missouri and Texas and other places they go into Kansas just to vote. Try to make it a slave state. They vote for slavery, trying to make it a slave state, and then ultimately go back home to Missouri or Texas or wherever it is they're from, right? So we have a lot of illegal voting for slavery. So the governor denounced the results, but didn't change them because he was scared for his life. The governor comes out and says, these results are bad. These results are not accurate. But we're going to accept them anyway. He's scared for his life. He's scared that if he says these results are not good, we're going to make it an anti-slavery state or whatever. If he does anything against slavery, he's scared for his life. These people cross state lines just to vote. What do you think they're going to do if he throws out their ballot, if he throws out their government. Okay? So the governor denounced the results but didn't change them because he was scared for his life. So now free state people set up their own government and the two governments begin to fight. Remember, the governor didn't change the results. He denounced them, said that they were bad, but he still accepts a slavery government. Well, the anti-slavery people don't like this. They're like, you just said the results aren't good, so shouldn't we be able to set up a government? So they set up their own government. And the two governments begin to fight. In May of 1856, 700 pro-slavery people attacked the city of Lawrence, Kansas. Okay? Again, in May of 1856, 700 pro-slavery people who were pro-slavery, attacked the city of Lawrence, Kansas. Where are we at? Right here. Okay, they attacked the city of Lawrence, Kansas. In return, John Brown and his sons. John Brown is a crazy guy. Almost the literal sense, maybe even the literal sense of the word crazy. Okay? We'll talk about him some more, but John Brown is this dude who is adamantly anti-slavery. So when he sees 700 pro-slavery people attack the city of Lawrence, an anti-slavery city, he gets upset. And in return, John Brown and his sons attacked at Potawatomi. Okay? They attacked down here at Potawatomi and becomes known as the Potawatomi Massacre. They dragged 5 men from their homes and hacked them to death. Just took axes and hatchets and stuff like that. Just hacked them to death. Hit them with sharp objects, right? Dragged 5 men from their home. They went to Potawatomi, dragged 5 men from their home, and hacked them to death. Following this, we end up with a guerrilla war between the two sides. And by the end of it, by the end of 1856, over 200 people were dead. Okay? So we're seeing a lot of craziness. Kansas, in essence, the state of Kansas is in the midst of a civil war over the issue of slavery. Okay? Now, more violence. Okay? The violence in Kansas carried over into Congress. Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts. Remember, Boston, Massachusetts. Boston was rioting over these issues in Kansas. Do you think they're going to be supportive of this? No. So Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts gave a speech that said that actions in Kansas were, quote, the rape of virgin territory. Quote, the rape of virgin territory, end quote, for the good of slavery. Those are strong, strong words. When you use the word rape, that has a strong connotation, right? So he's saying it's the rape of virgin territory. It's the destruction, the defiling of new and unused, new, potentially great things here with this new territory for the good of slavery. The rape of virgin territory for the good of slavery. Charles Sumner also personally attacked Andrew Butler from South Carolina. He attacked him as having a slave mistress and made fun of a speech problem that Andrew Butler had. Andrew Butler had recently suffered a stroke. I say recently, but he had suffered a stroke, and because of that, he had developed a speech impediment. Well, Charles Sumner personally criticizes Andrew Butler, says he has a slave mistress, and makes fun of his speech impediment. That's not going to go over well. Oh, by the way, who did I tell you at the beginning of the semester are people who always seem to start stuff, always start conflict? People from Massachusetts, people from South Carolina. Look at where these people are from. So nonetheless, Sumner personally attacked Andrew Butler and called the actions in Kansas the rape of virgin territory for the good of slavery. Now, this whole Sumner speech really upsets Preston Brooks. Preston Brooks is a congressman. He's in the House of Representatives. He's a congressman from South Carolina. And he's the nephew of Andrew Butler. So he goes to Sumner, accuses him of slander, and begins beating him with a cane, even to the point of breaking the cane. So here we have Preston Brooks, who is upset by what Charles Sumner said, and on top of it, he's Andrew Butler's nephew. So he's going to go, and remember, Southerners have this huge sense of Southern honor and loyalty and all that code stuff we talked about, right? This honor and code, this honor code of Southern gentlemen. Preston Brooks feels like that's been violated, so he walks up to Charles Sumner, accuses him of slander, and begins to beat him with a cane to the point where he broke the cane, and Charles Sumner is basically lying bloody and has to be helped out of the Capitol. Now, this happens in our nation's Capitol building, okay? So all of these things are very, very much like, this is a real conflict, a real fight. Now, what we see is that the North will begin to call Brooks, quote, Bully Brooks, but the South sees him as a hero, somebody willing to stand up and fight for them. To the point, like, the South sees Preston Brooks so much as a hero that some people will mail him canes. Like, he broke his cane beating up Charles Sumner. Like, he bloodied him. Like, Charles Sumner, I'm not going to say he was on the verge of death, but he was seriously injured from this. Preston Brooks, other Southerners will mail him canes and, letters of encouragement, like, hey, keep up the good fight. Here's another cane. I'm not saying they actually said that, but that's the mentality, right? Now, Preston Brooks resigned, but was reelected because many people thought he should continue to fight for slavery. So what we see is that, Preston Brooks, he resigns. Like, he admits, like, this was not conduct that's fitting of a congressman, and so he resigned because he knows that Congress would probably kick him out. But then the people of South Carolina are so supportive of him, like, being willing to fight for slavery in very much a literal sense, that they re-elect him. But yet the North sees him as this horrible person, and they call him Bully Brooks. Okay? So now we move on to the election of 1856. Okay? In the election of 1856, the Republicans nominate John Fremont. He had some ideas of the Whigs. He supported Transcontinental Railroad and internal improvements. The Republicans nominate John Fremont. The American Party nominates Millard Fillmore. They got the Whig leftovers. So remember, y'all, we saw Zachary Taylor was elected. We see everything happening. We see Millard Fillmore taking over for him, right? We talked about that before. If you remember, we go back. We see. Where's it at? Yeah, see, Millard Fillmore comes in and fills in for Taylor during the Compromise of 1850, but doesn't really follow up here in 1852. Now here we are in 1856, and he gets Whig leftovers and whoever's there, and they're going to call themselves the American Party. Now the Democrats are going to nominate James Buchanan. He was a longtime politician, and he's going to win with what we call a Southern coalition. He believed in making concessions to the South. Like, he gave a lot to the South, and in return, they're going to elect him, right? Like, that's the way this is going to work. So the Republicans nominate John Fremont, ideas of the Transcontinental Railroad and internal improvements. That's just not going to do it. Millard Fillmore, former president, running for the American Party. They're getting the Whig leftovers. But notice, y'all, there's no Whig party that's actually running. The Whigs are pretty much dead at this point. Okay? But the Democrats still there. James Buchanan's going to run for them. Longtime politician. He's going to win on a Southern coalition because he believed in making concessions to the South. And again, y'all, that got him elected, but it hurt his presidency. That got him elected, but it hurt his presidency. Okay? So, we move on to sectional divides. We're going to see some more stuff, y'all. This conflict of sections of the country really arguing back and forth. Okay? Now, first one we're going to look at is going to be the Dred Scott case, also known as the Dred Scott decision. Dred Scott was a slave, but he and his owner moved to a free state. So he sues for his freedom. Ultimately, it goes to the Supreme Court, and they said Scott was private property and still a slave because the Constitution says Congress cannot deprive people of property without due process. Okay? Basically, the Supreme Court follows up and uses the Calhoun resolutions, this idea of the Fifth Amendment. Oh, okay, look, hey, he's property. So even though Dred Scott and his owner were Dred Scott was a slave. He and his owner moved to a free state, and on that ground, he's gonna try to work he fights this idea of, well, how can I be a slave in a free state, right? And there's more complicated to it. It gets more complicated, but I'm trying to keep it simple. So at the end of the day, the Supreme Court said Scott was still private property and still a slave, because Congress can't deprive people of their property without due process of law. But what this in effect does, the Dred Scott decision, it really is horrible for Dred Scott. But on a big picture scale, what does it do? It in turn says the Missouri Compromise is unconstitutional. It basically says, well, if Dred Scott can go into a free state and still be a slave, then there's no such thing as a free state. Because all that means, all you have to do is buy a slave in the South and take them north with you. And then, hey, you take them to a free state, and all of a sudden that state is now a slave state. Because Supreme Court here, and Dred Scott says ultimately, he's still property. The North is extremely, extremely upset about this. That brings us to the Lecompton Constitution. We still have the issue of slavery in Kansas. Buchanan, who needed the support of the South, supports the pro-slavery Constitution. Okay? We have two elections. Each boycotted the other election, and neither does anything. But eventually Kansas will be taken over by the anti-slavery group. And I know that's kind of convoluted and doesn't explain a whole lot, but just get the note and it'll make sense a little bit as we go. So, Buchanan needs to support himself, so he's agreeing with this, what we would call this pro-slavery government. The pro-slavery government is based out of Lecompton and using what we call the Lecompton Constitution. Okay? So, Buchanan, a Democrat here, is supporting the pro-slavery Constitution. But we're going to have two elections. The pro-slavery people have an election, the anti-slavery people have an election. And the pro-slavery people boycott the anti-slavery election, the anti-slavery people boycott the pro-slavery election, right? So we have two elections, each side boycotted the other election, and neither does anything. But eventually Kansas will be taken over by the anti-slavery group. This is important because it caused an important split in the Democratic Party. The Lecompton Constitution ultimately is going to create an important split in the Democratic Party. Anti-slavery people like Stephen Douglas will split the Democratic Party up. So we see a lot of people who are Democrats, in essence, in the eye of Jackson, who are Democrats, but do not agree with slavery. And when all this stuff happens in Kansas, we're going to start to see the Northern and Southern Democrats start to split. So we're going to have a Republican Party, and we're going to have almost two Democratic parties, right? Notice where that trend might lead us in a few years. So it's important because it caused a split. The Lecompton Constitution is important because it caused a split in the Democratic Party. Anti-slavery people like Stephen Douglas will split the Democratic Party up. Now, the Panic of 1857. Remember, every 20 or 30 years we had one in 1837, right? Panic of 1857. Europe needed less grain, and industry outpaced itself. Okay? Like everything else, it quickly became about slavery because cotton prices rebounded quicker than anything. The South feels good and believes this is proof that slavery is the way to go. Okay, so Panic of 1857. Why did it happen? Europe stopped buying our grain and industry outpaced itself. What I mean by industry outpaced itself? Companies made more than they could sell. Like, think about it. How many of you own a toaster? Probably everybody. Most people, right? Most people own a toaster. How many of you own two? Maybe a few of you might own two toasters. How many of you own 10 toasters, right? Like, nobody. Right? Unless you own a hotel or a bed and breakfast, why do you own 10 toasters? Right? What we see happening, or a restaurant, right? What we see happening is what? Companies are making so much stuff that people aren't buying it. Okay? Well, industry outpaced itself. Europe's buying less grain. Okay? But like everything else, the issue of the Panic of 1857 becomes about slavery because cotton prices. As the economy recovers, cotton prices rebound. Cotton prices go up quicker than anything else. And so people in the South say, look, see, this is proof. Our way of life in the South, the Southern way of farming and using slaves to work those farms is the right way to go because we are recovering quicker than anything else. Okay? Because cotton prices rebounded quicker than anything. The South feels good and believes this is proof that slavery is the way to go. Okay? Now, we get the Lincoln-Douglas debates. Okay? Lincoln-Douglas debates. In Illinois in 1858, the Senate seat is up for election. Stephen Douglas wants to keep it. Stephen Douglas is up for election. He wants to keep his seat. Mainly because he wants to propel himself to the presidency in 1860. But the Republicans nominate Abraham Lincoln for this Senate election. Y'all, again, this is for the Senate in 1858. So what happens is that Lincoln is this new guy on the block. He's a Republican, and he's running, and he wants to try to win Stephen Douglas's spot in the Senate. Well, Stephen Douglas is trying to keep his spot in the Senate, and then in a couple years, in 1860, he's going to run for the presidency and hope he can win. Remember, he's the guy who got the Compromise of 1850 passed, right? So ultimately, he's a person who is well known. He's trying to stay in the national spotlight here in 1858, and in a couple years, he'll run for president. But then Lincoln comes to challenge him. Lincoln challenged Douglas to 7 debates over the year. Okay? Now, who is Lincoln at this point? Lincoln was anti-slavery, but not in favor of abolition. He just didn't want slavery to spread. There's still ideas of, people debate somewhat whether or not Lincoln was a person who was for, and I don't, the way in which we use this term today is not going to come off right, but the idea of like white supremacy, right? And I don't mean white supremacy in like how you think of it in today in recent context. Okay, again, we have to think pre-Civil War, but at this time there are people who are looking at things of not, they don't want slavery to spread, but it's not because they want to abolish it, right? I talked about that difference in the first video. There are abolitionists who are looking to get rid of slavery. Everywhere there are anti-slavery people who want to make sure it doesn't spread, right? And so the people who want to make sure slavery doesn't spread, sometimes it's not motivated because, we want to help black Americans. It's motivated by self-interest, right? And I'm not saying that Lincoln was one of those people, but when we look at it, when Lincoln here in 1858, what we see is that Lincoln was anti-slavery, but not in favor of abolition. And that'll continue on, at least for a few more years. We'll talk about that more as we get closer to the Civil War. But Lincoln was anti-slavery, but not in favor of abolition. He didn't want slavery to spread. Lincoln challenged Douglas to 7 debates over the year, and all were great debates. These 7 debates are legitimately well regarded as great debates between two intelligent individuals. Okay? Now, Douglas won the election, but the previously unheard of Lincoln gained national attention and started to build a following for himself and the Republican Party. So the thing here is that in the Lincoln-Douglas debates, Stephen Douglas is still going to win the election. But Lincoln, who's this little-known guy before, very few people knew about him before, now becomes a national household name. He and the Republican Party now start to develop an image and a likeness and something that people can identify with. It's not just some random person. It becomes Lincoln and the Republicans, right? Now, John Brown's raid. Remember John Brown, Potawatomi Massacre guy? He's back, okay? Now Brown is back and crazier than ever. He and 20 men traveled east into Maryland and Virginia. Then they attacked the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry. They attacked the federal arsenal, again, a place where we store weapons. They attacked the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry. His plan was to give the weapons to slaves trying to start rebellions. His plan was to give the weapons to slaves trying to start rebellions. Finally, the local militia and the U.S. Marines, led by Robert E. Lee, shut down Brown's raid. He was tried and hanged, but became a martyr for the anti-slavery people. So now everybody who is anti-slavery looks at John Brown as a guy who, in essence, is a martyr, somebody who's willing to die for the cause. somebody who had such strong convictions and such strong belief that slavery should be abolished that he was willing to die over. He was willing to attack U.S. Army locations, to take the weapons from the U.S. Army and give them to slaves so that slaves could rebel. Like, that person is super devoted to this cause, and he becomes a martyr. He's tried, he's convicted, and ultimately he's executed. But he becomes again a martyr, a person willing to die for their belief. He becomes a martyr for the anti-slavery people. Now, with Brown's reign and the rise of the Republican Party, all Southerners view Northerners with suspicion, and they associate anti-slavery with Republicans. So because of John Brown's reign and the rise of the Republican Party, now we see people like Lincoln and everything that's happening for the Republican Party building up its idea. What we see is that now all Southerners are going to view Northerners with suspicion. All Southerners kind of start to look at Northerners like, hey, what's your intention? What are you trying to do? Do you want to abolish slavery? Do you not want to let it spread? Are you okay with it as long as it doesn't go in your neighborhood? Like, they look at all Northerners with suspicion. And again, they associate anti-slavery with Republicans. Okay? Well, now we get that election of 1860. Now we get that presidential election. Okay? We see the Democrats finally split for good over the slavery issue. Southern Democrats, who are pro-slavery Democrats, are going to nominate John C. Breckinridge. He was the vice president. They nominate the vice president, John C. Breckinridge, to win, or for president here in 1860. Now, the Northern Democrats, the anti-slavery Democrats, are going to nominate Stephen Douglas. So our Northern anti-slavery Democrats are going to nominate Stephen Douglas. The Republicans, they are going to nominate Abraham Lincoln. Again, he made a great showing in that election, or in those debates with Stephen Douglas. Made a pretty good showing in the election. He lost to Stephen Douglas, but he's still going to be there. So the Republicans nominate Abraham Lincoln. He was anti-slavery, but not an abolitionist, and that was the perfect blend to get the Republican nomination. So again, Lincoln here, when he's running for president in 1860, again holding that idea, he's anti-slavery, but not an abolitionist. And again, that's the perfect blend to get the Republican nomination. They resisted the spread of slavery, but said each state should, quote, control its own domestic institutions. That's what Lincoln's going to say, y'all. When Lincoln is running for president here in 1860, he's anti-slavery. He's not looking to abolish slavery where it was. He's just looking to make sure it doesn't spread. That's what we see coming from Lincoln as he's running for president here in 1860. They resisted the spread of slavery, but said each state should, quote, control its own domestic institutions. Now, the Whigs, Constitutional Union Party, okay? So the Whig Party, also known as Constitutional Union Party. Remember, y'all, the Whigs they didn't even really have a major candidate. Their major candidate in 1856 really ran under the title of the American Party, right? So the Whigs are pretty weak. We also see this other group kind of combining with the Whigs called the Constitutional Union Party. They nominate John Bell. Y'all, this is the last chance for the Whigs. That's the main thing I want you to understand. It's the last chance for the Whigs. And their whole idea is preservation of the Constitution and the Union. That's their big idea, preservation. That's why I call it the Constitutional Union Party. They want to preserve. They want to keep the Union and the Constitution together. Okay? Now, Lincoln wins pretty easily because, let's face it, the Whigs / Constitutional Union Party, they're not going to do anything. And what's going to happen? Y'all, let's think about it like this. Let's say 10% of the country, and these aren't real numbers, I'm just giving you numbers, okay? But let's say the Whigs made up 10% of Americans. Okay, well then, and the other 90% of Americans, 45% are Democrats and 45% are Republicans. Well, how's the voting going to be split up? Lincoln gets 45%, Douglas and Breckinridge each get 22.5%, and John Bell gets 10%, right? So Lincoln is ultimately going to win easily because of the Democratic split. He had 180 electoral votes, and the next closest was Breckinridge with 72. To kind of put this in perspective, this is the election map. Okay, the red states are the states that Lincoln and the Republicans won. Then the kind of oranges are won by Bell. Stephen Douglas won the blue state there, and Breckinridge won the green. So again, y'all, think about it. Southern states where Democrats were going to be dominant. Think about the South, Democrats, they are going to win, they're going to go with the Southern Democrat. The northern states largely are going to vote Republican, and so John Bell and Stephen Douglas aren't really going to get a whole lot of votes, and ultimately Lincoln's going to win pretty handily. Again, he had 180 electoral votes, and the next closest was Breckinridge with 72. Okay, so what's that mean? What's it mean, y'all? If the South and Democrats looked at all Northerners with suspicion and saw all Republicans as anti-slavery, well, what just happened? We elected a Republican president. Great. So now the South is thinking what? They're going to try to get rid of our slaves. And remember, y'all, the South is not going to make a big distinction between abolition and anti-slavery because it's all in opposition to slavery, right? But let's look at it. With Lincoln elected, South Carolina moves to secede from the Union in December of 1860. December of 1860. Y'all, Lincoln was elected in November. He won't even take office until March of 1861. But here in December of 1860, South Carolina is looking to secede. Okay, remember, y'all, secede, not succeed. By February of 1861, Mississippi, Alabama, Texas, Florida, Georgia, and Louisiana followed suit. Basically, our deep south, right? So South Carolina and all the deep south. Mississippi, Alabama, Texas, Florida, Georgia, and Louisiana followed suit. In early February, those states held a convention in Montgomery, Alabama. There they created a new nation that they called the Confederate States of America with its own constitution and a president and vice president, Jefferson Davis and Alexander Stephens, respectively. So, here in December of 1860, South Carolina, again, who's our crap starters? Who's the people who always start stuff? South Carolina, right? South Carolina secedes from the Union first. They say, we're leaving the United States. No, Lincoln hasn't even taken office yet. He won't take office until March. But because he is a Republican and because he's anti-slavery, again, remember, Lincoln had no intention of interfering with slavery where it already existed. He just didn't want to see it spread. He's an anti-slavery, not an abolitionist. But Southerners don't see that. Southern Democrats don't see that. What they ultimately see is an anti-slavery person who's now going to be president. We're leaving. We're just getting out. So, South Carolina secedes in December of 1860. February of 1861, 6 more states, Mississippi, Alabama, Texas, Florida, Georgia, and Louisiana follow suit. In February of 1861, in early February, those states held a convention in Montgomery, Alabama. By February of 1861, those other 6 states joined. So by February of 61, we have 7 states that have left the Union, and they hold a convention in Montgomery, Alabama. They create a new nation. They unite and say, we're not a part of the United States. We are a new nation. We are the Confederate States of America. We have our own constitution. They set up their own constitution, and they established Jefferson Davis as their president and Alexander Stephens as their vice president. Remember Jefferson Davis? His father-in-law was Zachary Taylor. He fought in the Mexican War. Alexander Stephens at this point is a well-known politician as well. Okay. Now Lincoln doesn't take office until March of 1861. So he can't do much. Okay, Lincoln, everybody knows Lincoln is going to be president, but he's not president yet. So he can't do much. Like, he can't come out and force anybody to do anything because technically he's not president yet. And the current president, James Buchanan, didn't do much here. This is one of the reasons why most people rank Buchanan as one of the worst presidents. Because ultimately here, he's not going to do much to try to stop this. He's not going to try to, he doesn't do much to try to fix this issue of the southern states leaving. At this point in time, they haven't declared a war. They just said, hey, we're out. State of South Carolina, state of Louisiana, state of Alabama, Mississippi. Hey, we are no longer part of the United States. We want out. We're starting our own thing. Like, they haven't started a war. They're just saying they're leaving. And Buchanan doesn't adequately do anything to try to reel them back in. Now, some people, one of the things that Buchanan will be a part of, some people try to pass what's known as the Crittenden Compromise, which would keep slavery where it was and extend the 3630 line, but it failed. So y'all, here we have the Crittenden Compromise. This was a last-ditch effort. Some people say, look, we're going to take the 3630 line, extend it all the way across, keep slavery where it is, extend the 3630 line, and that'll settle it. But y'all, it failed, and ultimately, this is just too little, too late. So that wraps up where we were at. That wraps up chapter 16 for us. Ultimately, what we get here is Lincoln gets elected, and immediately some southern states decide, nope, we're out, we're done. And that's going to lead to problems. Some people try to reconcile at the last minute with the Crittenden Compromise, but it fails. The southern states have already started to secede, which will ultimately lead to conflict in what we call the American Civil War, and we'll pick up with that in chapter 17. Okay, so that wraps it up for chapter 16. This was part 2 of 2, and I'll see y'all next time for chapter 17.